There we go. All right. So a big hello and a welcome to our LBC webinar on the topic of grief with special reference to grief through COVID-19. My name's Natasha and I'm one of the support services coordinators for Leukemia and Blood Cancer New Zealand. I usually cover the Northland DHB area and the Counties Manukau DHB area. So on behalf of LBC, our community of patients, supporters and families, I would like to welcome Amy Hemmington to our education webinar today. Amy is a health psychologist for the cancer support team in Counties Manukau DHB. So Amy has been in this role for 3 years and she works alongside other psychologists and social workers to provide psychosocial support for patients who have any cancer diagnosis. So today, Amy will be talking with us about grief and the reality of losing a loved one, with special reference to this in the COVID-19 climate. On behalf of everyone here, I would like to say a big thank you for sharing your insight, your expertise, and for being here with us today. And for all of you out there watching this webinar, you'll be able to see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So feel free to submit any questions at any time throughout this talk, and we'll be able to address these at the end. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Amy, to start off our webinar for today.
Lovely, thanks Natasha. I'll just share my screen so we can see the presentation.
Awesome.
Hopefully everyone can see that.
Looks great from me, Amy. I'll mute myself now and I'll spotlight your video a bit so that people can see you alongside your presentation. So just yell out if you need anything because I'll still be here.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
And thank you for the introduction, Natasha. Hello, everybody. I must say it feels quite strange doing a talk to my laptop and not seeing anyone in front of me. I didn't realise how important the interaction was with the audience until doing this, but this is a new experience and we're living in strange times, so I guess we're all adjusting the way that we work and the way that we're living. So yeah, we'll see how we go. I also just wanted to give everyone a heads up because my office is actually located next to a train line. So if you hear any strange rumbling at points during the presentation, I do apologise. It's just a big freight train probably going past. So a previous colleague of mine was a great presenter. She now works in a different DHB, but when she started presenting and was giving us tips on how to present, she told us that lots of research had suggested that it can be helpful to have the main points right at the start of the presentation. We know that it's quite hard to maintain concentration for a whole talk, whether that's half an hour or an hour. And so I'm going to just briefly run through some key take-home points at the start. I will go into more depth, obviously, throughout the talk today. But then you can fall asleep in the middle if you do, and it won't matter. So first of all, grief is a normal reaction to loss. It's part of being human. It's part of adjusting to a loss. Grief can be messy. Be patient with yourself. It's okay to be still. And remember that you're coping better than you think. When it comes to helping others grieving a loss, the most important thing and the most helpful thing that we can do is often just to bear witness to that and be there, to acknowledge and validate the loss for that person, and also be guided by them and where they're at in that process. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the different types of losses, but there are many. So we can lose people, whether that's through death or the breakdown of a relationship. We can lose things. That might be a job or an heirloom or a personal item that holds some significance to you. We can also lose our identities. So, for example, an athlete who injures himself and then is no longer able to play the sport that he has played all his life. We can also have lots of losses when it comes to our health. So that might be a loss of function, a loss of independence, loss of your fertility. And we can also grieve future losses. So say, for example, the passing of a child, we may grieve the future loss in the sense that we don't get to see them be married or meet our future grandchildren. And I think really the main message here is that we don't just grieve people, that there are lots of different things that we can grieve. The focus today will be more on grieving people though. And also the little losses in life prepare us for the big losses. And I think that's quite important to remember. So these little losses that we have throughout our lives prepare us for the times when we may experience a bigger loss than we have experienced before. But those little losses that we've experienced previously help to teach us that we can recover from that, and how we recover from that. So think of those little losses as preparing you. At the moment, we are grieving as a country, and more broadly as the world, I guess. We are dealing with quite strange times given what's happening at the moment with COVID-19. We're grieving many different losses: the loss of freedom, the loss of a job or a business. We're grieving still the death of loved ones and also isolation from loved ones. We're also grieving the loss of normality. Everyone has had to adjust to a new normal. And potentially also grieving the loss of a sense of security and safety at the moment. And this grief has actually been shown in many different ways. And we've shown support for those grieving in many different ways. This is just a snippet from an article, and there's a couple of big companies in this article that have donated things to hospitals and DHBs and different services to help during this time. So, for example, Facebook donated 720,000 masks and 1.5 million pairs of gloves. And Tesla were looking at starting to manufacture ventilators. It also has down here distilleries intended for beer, whiskey and rum were transformed into to turn out hand sanitizers and disinfectants instead. We've also seen, as you probably have seen on your walks around town, bears in windows, and this was a lovely little initiative that was started to help, I guess, give children a reason to walk around and what to look out for in their little bear hunt. And we've seen signs all over the place thanking people for their support. There's also, I've seen a lot of videos of impromptu music concerts on people's balconies and people running workouts on their balconies. There really has been an outpouring of support and helping people to move through this period of grief, which I think is quite important to acknowledge. At times this grief may have felt particularly hard, and at times it might have felt a little easier. A bit further on, I'll bring up a slide with a picture of how grief works, and it can be pretty messy. And that's in a normal context. So in today's context, it can be even harder when we're faced with uncertainty and the lack of distractions. We're isolated. It can be particularly difficult and particularly overwhelming. We humans are phenomenally resilient, actually, and if anything from my work in cancer, that's something that I have taken away, just how resilient human beings are and really what we can deal with. We're built to withstand stresses and to make our way through those, but we're not built to withstand stress for very long periods of time. And so in the current situation, when we're having to deal with ongoing stresses for an extended period of time, it can be particularly draining. And I guess the main message here is that at the moment, grief may feel very different. It may feel different to how you've experienced it in the past. And that's likely to be because of the different circumstances that we're in at the moment. But the things that make it better, and the things that we will talk about today in terms of strategies for helping you to move through that, will remain the same. They're still the same things that will help. I love this quote. Grief is the price that we pay for love. And I've actually heard the Queen say this exact thing in one of her Christmas speeches. Love and grief are two sides of the same coin, essentially. We grieve because we have loved. And sometimes that small shift in thinking about grief can be really powerful in terms of reflecting on, this grief is so strong because I loved that person so much, or that thing that I loved and lost. Gosh, so grief is tough. It's hard, but why does it feel like this? I think we often ask ourselves this when we're in the midst of a grief journey. You know, why am I feeling this way? Why is this so hard? What could possibly be the reason for feeling like this? Grief is a normal and healthy process. It helps us to gradually adjust to the loss of someone or something. And it does serve a function. So the effects of grief, which make us withdraw, make us feel tired, make us feel uninterested in things, actually serve a purpose in that it almost forces us to be still. It forces us to be still and process and ponder the loss that we have experienced and adjust to that gradually. So we do feel this way for a reason. It also serves an evolutionary purpose in that grief elicits support from others at a time when we may need it. And I've got a lovely little video now, fingers crossed that this works, of a group of langur monkeys interacting with a robot monkey called Spy Monkey. And it really demonstrates this quite nicely. Let's see how we go with this.
In Rajasthan, the temple langurs have taken Spy Monkey into the heart of the family. But some are keen to take the budding relationship to the next level and are getting a little too familiar. One seems to want to babysit her. But disaster strikes. An injured baby is a cause for concern. And this langur seems to believe she's died. Then, something extraordinary happens. The monkeys gather round the motionless spy creature, as if it is a real baby. They react just as they do when their own babies die. A calm and contemplative mood descends on the colony. There's a sense of grief, as well as empathy for one another. Quite accidentally, our spy creature is at the centre of something extraordinary, capturing emotions that have rarely been observed.
I think it's a really beautiful example of grief, and it also shows that it's not just humans, animals grieve too. And what we were seeing there is, you know, when the baby monkey, the spy monkey, had fallen and the monkeys thought that it had died, they all rallied around. They were all there for each other, and their grief elicited support in each other. This is the picture I was talking about earlier. So as I said, grief is a normal human reaction to the loss of something or someone. And it's made up of lots of different emotions. It's not just one. So it can be sadness or anger, guilt or regret. We can feel many things when we are grieving the loss of someone. And as we can see in this picture, the way that we want grief to work is often actually not how it works in reality. So on the left, a straight line with an end point. And on the right, how grief actually tends to work is kind of a big, messy, squiggly line that actually doesn't really end, but you know, it doesn't have an end point, it carries on. And there is no set time period for grief, which can feel quite daunting and overwhelming to hear when you're in the midst of it. But the reality is that grief doesn't actually disappear necessarily. Typically what happens is we integrate that loss, that grief into our life, and we are able to live around that grief because the loss has still happened. It's also not a test. We don't pass or fail, and there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Often we compare ourselves to other people, and this can be unhelpful because there are so many individual differences in the way that people go through grief. And actually we can see this in some of the pictures that I have coming up now. Cultures grieve in very different ways, and we can often see this through the many and varied rituals that they use to mark a death or a loss. And just like different cultures grieve differently, individuals grieve differently within these cultures. There's no set way. I thought it might be helpful also just to clarify the difference between grief and depression, because sometimes it can feel like you're depressed, and though they are very similar, they are also different. So grief and depression do share some common characteristics. Grief can induce depressive-like symptoms. So for example, feeling really, really down, feeling fatigued, or noticing changes in your sleeping patterns or your appetite, maybe a difficulty concentrating. And these are all symptoms of depression, but they are two different things. So grief is a specific reaction to loss and therefore occurs only at a time of loss. Whereas depression is more of a consistent and pervasive sense of distress that isn't necessarily tied to anything in particular. And so I think it can be quite helpful to know the difference between the two, and to be able to remind yourself that although it may feel like some depressive-like symptoms, that this is grief, and that we don't want to pathologize grief, aka make it a clinical diagnosis and something that we need to fix, because grief is a normal and natural process that we work through. We don't necessarily fix grief. So grief is a really complex bundle of emotions and behaviours, and psychologists, we love to make models out of that because it helps us to understand what's going on and why it's happening. And I'm not sure if you can see quite the top, but up here it just says the stages of grief. And this is quite a well-known model to conceptualise grief actually. It's generally accepted that there are 5 stages. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's really no set pattern in terms of the way that people move through these stages. It is generally thought of as a succession from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance, but actually in reality people tend to move backwards and forwards between these stages, and often they will skip a stage or miss a stage completely. I thought maybe we'd go through each of these stages and just think about what an example might be at each of these, to think kind of how this would look. And so for denial, that might be finding out that you have a palliative diagnosis, a terminal cancer, for example, and not talking about that with anybody, and getting up the next day, heading off to work, and pretty much just acting like nothing's happened. That would be a denial type state. Anger might be something that people are experiencing right now, you know, the death of a loved one and not having been able to see them, you know, whether that's because they're in hospice or in hospital and you haven't been able to visit them because of the restrictions that we have in place at the moment. It would be natural to be experiencing some anger and frustration around that. Bargaining might be going through a divorce and making a pact with God that you'll go to church every Sunday if your marriage is saved. Bargaining can happen in many different ways, but essentially it is that process of, oh, but if I just do this, will it take that loss or that grief away? Depression might be finding out that you've lost your job and then those depressive-like symptoms kicking in. So feeling down, not wanting to talk to people, finding that you're unable to sleep or not able to eat like you would normally. And acceptance, which is generally regarded as sort of the final stage of grief, would look like, you know, having lost a loved one maybe some months ago, but being able to remember the good times and being able to celebrate their life, you know, with a family gathering or something on their birthdays. If you think back to a previous loss that you've been through, or potentially even a loss that you're experiencing at the moment, you may be able to identify having gone through one or many of these stages. And I wondered, you know, take a moment now and just have a think about, in relation to a loss that you're experiencing, what stage might you be in? I think it's helpful to do this, as it gives you a way of understanding your own grief and where you're at in that process. And it can be a reminder that it's normal what you're feeling and what you're going through, and that actually it's to be expected that many others go through a similar process too. This is another way of thinking about grief, and this focuses more on what goes into the process of grieving. And grief is an active process of adjustment. This doesn't necessarily mean that anything is expected of you, that you have to do something in order to cope with your grief or get rid of your grief in any way, but it can provide some guidance around what might need to go into that process. And I find this model particularly helpful for people who are quite task or goal oriented. So as I said before, we all have different personalities, upbringings and experiences, and this shapes the way that we grieve. So for someone with a personality that is quite task orientated or goal focused, this can be quite a helpful model to use, because it gives a sense of what needs to be achieved or what you need to go through in order to kind of assimilate that loss and that grief into your life. And just like the last one, any one of these stages can happen first or last, and you may skip a stage. But generally, it's to accept the loss that that person has gone, to acknowledge the pain of that loss, the suffering that comes with it, to adjust to a new world without that person, and also to reinvest in that new reality, in your new world without that person. You may find either of these models more helpful than the other, and that's completely up to you. You may find neither helpful, but hopefully there's been some parts of either one that you've been able to liken to your own experience. So how do we cope with grief? Well, I think the first thing really is that it's important to check in with yourself. So we need to be aware of how we're feeling and how we're doing in order to cope with that and to do what is needed. And so regularly checking in with how you are going and how the family are going in coping with the loss. It's also important to be patient with yourself, and this can sometimes be the hardest one. Grief does take time, and that squiggly line doesn't just uncurl itself straight away. You may have days where you feel like you're not doing it right, or that you should be better by now, or questioning how other people seem to cope with it so much better. And that's all normal. The best thing that you can do is really just give yourself the space and the time to be able to grieve and to move through that process. If we think back to the 4 tasks of mourning, this is experiencing the pain and accepting the loss. And that might mean asking for help. So asking for help from friends or family members. It may be pushing out the household chores for a couple of days, ordering a takeaway for dinner one night instead of cooking, saying no to an event that you just don't feel like you have the energy to go to. Or it may be even as simple as saying to yourself, I'm suffering, this hurts, and it's okay. I think it's also important to remember that it's okay to be still. So as I mentioned before, the effects of grief, the way that it makes us feel, is actually helpful in the sense that it forces us to slow down and to process the loss that we've experienced. So that there isn't a pressure to move forward, there isn't a pressure to move on. It's okay to sit with that and to be still for a while. Just gonna have a sip of water. And I think I said this right at the start, that even when you feel like you're not coping, you're probably coping better than what you think. You got out of bed, you got dressed, you fed yourself, you fed the dog, you got the kids to school, you got yourself to work, you did the washing. You would have done any number of these tasks throughout your days. And that's a sign that you are coping. You are still getting on with things. So I've got here as well that rituals and routine can be helpful. Rituals are well known to be helpful in terms of marking a loss. Typically, we do that through a funeral or a tangi or a wake, but there may also be more personalised ways of ritualising a loss and your grief, whether that's visiting a place that you held dear, you and that person, or going through some old photo albums, or going through their clothes or their belongings at their home. These can be really powerful parts of the process of coming to terms with grief and loss. Maintaining old routines or finding new ones can also be really helpful. I think we've heard that quite a lot actually through this time, that in a time of uncertainty and change, maintaining some form of routine in your daily life can be really helpful. And I think we probably all have seen that firsthand if we've given it a go. I know that for me, that's been really helpful, maintaining my normal routine as much as I can. And so in the case of grief, that's also really helpful. It helps to regain your footing in your world, in a world that potentially has changed quite a bit. And if we think back to the 4 tasks of mourning, this is adjusting to the new reality and reinvesting in your life. I've also got down here to look after yourself. And this is probably the most common sense one, but it's often the first one that falls off the priority list. And there's no pressure to do this, but it can be really helpful. And so remembering that these things are important, that you need to get rest and you need to find opportunities for relaxation. That it's good to maintain some form of activity or exercise where you're able to, continuing to eat regular meals and balanced healthy meals if you can. And although you may feel like you want to withdraw, taking as many opportunities as you feel able to be connected with friends and family. and also to continue to engage in the things that you enjoy, so any hobbies, anything that gives you pleasure. Which leads me on to the next point, which is to really take note of those pockets of enjoyment. You know, even when we're grieving, there will be times when we can laugh or when we can find happiness. And it's important to take note of these and enjoy those. You're not wrong to be feeling happiness in a time where you're grieving. It doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong or that you should feel guilty. If anything, those are the moments that help to keep us going. Obviously, you know, we want to be able to help other people when they're grieving too. And so these are some of the things that we can do to help others. The one that I've put at the top is companioning. And I think this is really the most powerful thing that you can do for someone who's experiencing a loss. Really what this means is just bearing witness, being with that person and allowing them the space and the silence to grieve alongside somebody. That might be putting your hand on their shoulder or giving them a hug. It might be helping out at home. It may just be sitting with them on the couch whilst they cry. That can be enough. It's also helpful to acknowledge the loss. I think that sometimes we feel like we don't want to say anything because either we don't know what to say, how could we make this situation better, or we're worried that we'll upset that person. But in fact, often the best thing that you can do is to say something. For example, it might be as simple as, I'm really sorry to hear that Bill died. Or just validating that they must be going through a really difficult time at the moment, and how are they? It's okay to ask how somebody is, and actually often this will give you really helpful information about how they're coping and what stage they're at. People may react differently depending on how they are going, but don't be put off by that. It's more a sign of kind of where they're at in the process. They may be in the anger stage, or they may be in the denial stage. And obviously validate and normalize their grief. And it's always helpful to know that they're not alone and that this is a normal process. Hearing that can be really powerful too. And on this last slide, I've just got a few resources. The Grief Centre and What's Your Grief are two great websites that have lots of different resources and articles focused on the process of grief and dealing with a loss. And a really wonderful book, What Abby Taught Us by Lucy Hone. I would really recommend that book. Lucy Hone is a psychologist, a British psychologist whose daughter died in a car crash when she was quite young. I think she was only 12. And Lucy Hone then wrote this book based on her experience being a grieving mother, but also as a psychologist and what she found helpful. And so it's a really nice opportunity to kind of marry those two together and to read about that. I would definitely recommend. There's also lots of children-specific resources. I did have a slide in here to talk about that, but I wasn't sure if we were going to have time. So I would definitely recommend having a look at some of these different websites if you have a child who is experiencing a loss. Skylight is wonderful. They've got heaps of resources. There's also this really cool Sesame Street toolkit as well, which I've popped up there. And this idea of a graffiti wall for kids, which you can find on that website link as well. Yeah, so that's everything that I had to share today. And I think, as Natasha said, if there's any questions, happy to answer those questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. That was amazing. I'll see if I can take down the share screen.
And then we can stop that.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Awesome. Oh, just some thoughts from what you shared. I mean, that was an awesome presentation. You really covered a huge amount in that space of time. So thank you so much, Amy. It was fantastic. I think I just made a couple of notes, the tasks of grief. sounded like something that really kind of resonated with me. I know having something to focus on can be really useful when you feel like you're kind of in maybe like the muddy waters of grief where you can't really see past what's in front of you. I think if you can move your mind to maybe a place where you can take action, that could probably be quite useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're so right that, you know, it can feel, that was a really nice example actually, those muddy waters where it all feels really unclear and you're not sure how to take another step forward really. It can be helpful to look at those 4 tasks of mourning and think, you know, where am I at and what's something that could be helpful for me in this process, in this stage that I'm in at the moment.
Absolutely. I can see we've got a couple of questions that have come through. So would you be happy for me to maybe read them out and see if we can answer them? So we've got one here just saying, thank you for acknowledging the grief process and that there is no right or wrong and not a time frame. That was a comment there. We've also got one here saying, is there a point where being still and not moving on stops being normal processing of grief and becomes a cause of concern? At what point would you recommend someone seeking further help?
That is a really good question, because, you know, it is important to be still and allow that process of grief to happen naturally, but absolutely that there are times when maybe that grief becomes complicated and it feels like we're not moving forward at all and that we've been still for a very long time. And sometimes I think it's helpful to think about the impact that it's having on your life. So, you know, if you're struggling to get the kids to school or to go to work, or it's impacting on, you know, not eating or spending a lot of time in bed, I think if that's quite a consistent theme for you and that's been happening for a long time, then that might be the time to reach out and maybe get some extra support. I also think that, you know, even if you're not at that stage, even if you're at the stage where you're still in the normal part of processing grief, it's also okay to reach out for some extra support through a psychologist or a counsellor then, because that can only help in the process. You don't necessarily need to be really struggling to see a counsellor or psychologist. It can be just to help with those early stages of grief. So absolutely at any time you could seek out that support, and I would recommend it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And it's a great point and really validating to know that, you know, accessing support doesn't have to come at any stage in that kind of cycle and the stages of grief. It could come at any point. And it's a tool in your toolkit, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think often I use this metaphor, and people may have heard this before, but we want to be the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom. It's so much easier to intervene and to be helpful at the early stages, and often can make greater changes then and stop the added distress of when it goes further on.
That's really good to know. So we've got just a comment here. We may know this innately, but having the reassurance from a health professional is really, really reassuring. So it's awesome. Got another one here. I've heard there is no timeline on grief. Is that old thinking that you should be finished with grief after 5 to 10 years? I heard a podcast about long-term ambiguous grief that persists. Wonder if you could comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to that point of, you know, grief actually never really goes away. Maybe the really difficult parts of grief get easier, but the grief itself and the loss itself doesn't disappear. Actually, what happens is we build our life around that. And it's difficult to show you here, but I once was shown this image from another psychologist. And if we think about in the early stages of grief, when we first experienced that loss, if we think of grief like this, and then maybe our life is just a little bit bigger than that. But as we move through the years and the processes of grief, the grief stays the same, but we build a bigger and bigger and bigger life around that. And so eventually, proportionally, the grief isn't taking up so much of our life. It's still there and it's still the same, but we've been able to expand our lives around that and continue to enjoy and reinvest and make the most of our lives.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Amy. I can see a comment here just saying thank you so much. It was a great presentation. Haven't heard of the tasks of grief, the TENA model before. Think that will be really helpful.
Oh, I'm glad.
That's awesome to hear. So if we've got another question that's come through. And anybody else who's got any questions, feel free to flick them through over the next couple of minutes. So we've got a question: as a close friend or even as a support worker following up with someone who is palliative, is there a suggested thing to say to them, in quotes, conscious not to say the wrong thing? I have heard it's best to focus on what they are getting up to today as living in the present and not asking too much about the future. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is helpful to focus on how they're going in the moment. Because in a stage of grief, it can be really hard to think about the future, and people may not be ready to even envisage a future without the person that they've lost, or if for themselves they're dealing with a diagnosis, dealing with the idea of not being around in the future. So I think, yeah, it can be really helpful to try and focus on the present moment. But also you can still acknowledge their grief and that they're probably going through a period of suffering and that they themselves are grieving, that they'll be grieving the future losses, so that they may not see their grandchildren grow up or their children marry or whatever it is, that with a palliative diagnosis, it's probably the future losses that they will be grieving.
Sorry, I just lost my connection for a minute there. Awesome, thank you, Amy. I'm just going to check that we don't have any other questions. I think we're all good.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I just wanted to say a massive thank you. I think that, you know, grief is something that we all experience, and like you said, it's the flipped side of love, and I'd like to think that everybody at some point in their life has something that they love or someone that they love, and then when you lose that, it's such a significant part of your life, and coping through that can be quite hard, I think.
Yeah.
And it is something that we all relate to, and then with, you know, the special look into COVID-19 and thinking about all those people who are, you know, managing grief for the loss of a life or another part of their life, but also coping with the grief that, you know, COVID-19 has brought to their life. It's pretty significant.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'll look to close up our webinar for today. Say a big thank you again. And for anybody out there who's joined us today, who's maybe thinking that, you know, they're feeling a bit stuck with their grief, or, you know, they're going through a hard time, you have your support service coordinators, you have some wonderful people part of the DHB, like Amy, who are there to help you out as well. So please do get in touch with any one of us and we'll see what we can do to help. All right. Well, thank you very much, Amy. I'll stop recording and I'll end our call.
Okay, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care, Amy, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.